Thank you very much, Guy. That was outstanding. It captures our imagination even before reading all the book, although we've begun it. So Guy is also a major speaker in the TED conferences, and we are really privileged to have him here. And now we come to William Baer, who leads PwC's One Security practice in Europe, and over 20 years of international experience in helping organizations like bank and financial systems and government protect themselves. He is a major contributor to the regulators at the EU, and we are very, very privileged to have him here. Thank you very much, Mr. Baer.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. I know how important security is here in Israel, and how much incredible technical innovation comes out of this country. So it's fantastic to see such a full room, and also fantastic to see such great support from senior business leaders and also government leaders. My presentation is focusing on cyber, obviously, but it's focusing on both the risks and the rewards. And I think that's very important. And this presentation was based on some research that we did for the UK government, and also a piece of research that we're currently conducting in PwC globally, and that should be published towards the end of the month. But what is coming out of those two pieces of research, which I think is so very important, and some of my colleagues have already touched on this, is that the current approach to security is not working. And I think that's very, very concerning and should really cause us all to reflect and think about how we can do things differently. Obviously, if organizations like RSA, Lockheed, Google, Sony, and the list goes on and on and on, who have very deep pockets and have invested a lot of time and money and resources in trying to protect themselves, are still suffering, what hope is there for the rest of us? So hopefully this presentation will give you some indications and some ideas that you can then use when you go back to your day jobs. So, first of all, as I said before, I think we really need to recognize that cyber is not just a bad thing. Unfortunately, it has begun to take on a negative perception and a negative connotation. I think things really began to change, at least in my mind, when I picked up the Financial Times after Google suffered problems in China. And I picked up the Financial Times in the morning, and it was on page 1, page 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And it was all very negative. It wasn't enough focus, I don't think, on the opportunities. But now, for many senior business officials, when they hear the word cyber, they think of negative aspects. And I think as security professionals, we need to think about that and make sure that we can help business leaders and government leaders both understand the risks and also the rewards. But as has been said before, cyber is a very different space. To my mind, I think there's still a lot of confusion out there around what cyber actually means. If you were to ask probably 10 people in this audience right now, can you define cyber? I'm quite convinced you would get very different answers, and maybe they're not all going to be that clear. There was a very interesting piece of research that was published out of South Africa back in the year 2000 by a professor called Professor Holm, which I think is really interesting. And you may want to Google it and look it up, or take my card afterwards and I can send you a link. But when it was published in the year 2000, he actually talked about the 3 waves of security. It has now been updated, and it's now titled in 2010, the 5th wave of information security. And I think it gives a very succinct, very clear definition of what cyber is. And in a nutshell, building on what the other presenters have already said, the definition of cyber, according to Professor Holm and the 5th wave of security, is really about cyber is looking outwards. But I think we need to think about that, and we need to ensure that if there's confusion in our community, how can we try and help business leaders and government leaders also learn and understand both the opportunities as well as the risks? And I think another thing that has come out of some of the previous presentations, but is very, very clear in the conversations I'm having with my clients and also the work that we've done, as I mentioned before, with the government in the UK and some of the research we're doing globally, is that most organizations today are not structured properly to fight back or to protect themselves. And I think that's a great and significant area of concern that we need to think about. I think that certain industry standards, whether it be things such as PCI DSS or possibly even ISO 27001, while they offer a good control framework and offer a lot of support and help us focus our energy and our time, can actually hinder our performance and can actually slow us down. So I think we need to be very careful when we put too much trust, too much faith in some of these regulations and some of these standards, because they can actually become a ball and chain. So what are some of the barriers to cybersecurity based on the research that we've done? Well, first of all, we know it's an arms race. And I think that we understand that the organized criminals, or if it's state-led attacks, are very nimble, very quick, very technically advanced, and also very well funded. And I think most of the organizations I'm working with are struggling to get their defenses in sync, or even justify the right level of spending, the right level of technology, the right level of people to protect themselves. And as I said before, I think cybersecurity, and this is probably one of the areas that really concerns me most, is still pigeonholed as IT security. And I think as a community, we really need to think about that carefully and ensure that business leaders understand this is not about IT. Cybersecurity, as I said before, is an evolution of information security, which in itself is an evolution of IT security, but it really is much bigger than that. It's about people, processes, and technology. And unfortunately, most of the organizations I'm working with, yes, they've dealt with the technical aspects and invested lots of time and money in getting the technology in place, which is fantastic. They've started to focus their time and energy around the processes, and I mentioned PCI, I mentioned ISO, which is great, so better governance. But one area where a lot of organizations are still really not mature is around security awareness. So when we look at organizations and we ask them, what is the culture in your organization with regards to protecting your data? Do your employees understand how their own behavior could negatively impact the organization they work for? Oftentimes the answer is no. Oftentimes the answer is we do a CBT, a computer-based training program. In our view, that is not enough. A computer-based training program for security awareness that's maybe run once a year is really just a tick-the-box exercise. And good security awareness needs to be done over years, and it needs to touch on people's emotions to really help them understand what they need to do differently. And as I said before, unfortunately, most organizational structures that are in place right now, so most security functions, are probably not fit for purpose. Based on some of the recent events that we've seen, and I mentioned a couple of the names, and some of them have been mentioned before, so Sony, Lockheed, RSA, we're starting, though, to see back in Europe some really difficult conversations taking place between the business and the security function. And I think this actually represents an opportunity for the security function to step up to the plate. So what we're starting to see is that board of directors, the C-suites are beginning to ask difficult and probing questions about the information security functions that have been put in place in their organizations. Do they have enough budget? Do they have the right skill set? And maybe more importantly, are they sitting in the right place in the organization? Where do they sit on the organizational chart? And do they have enough authority and do they have enough power to cut through the red tape and move quickly when necessary? And based on my experience to date, most organizations do not have the right security functions in place. They do not have the right security teams in place. So I think this is a wonderful time of opportunity for us to step up to the plate and help to support the business better. So as I said before, we did some research, and this specific piece of research, as I said, was done for the UK government, and it was looking at the future of information security and what are some of the key drivers out there that are going to cause both challenges and also opportunities. And if you just want to jot down Technology Strategy Board, PwC, if you Google it, you should come up with the report, which was called Evolution or Revolution. But the interesting thing to my mind, and also really, really frustrating thing, was the first bullet. As I've said before, a lot of organizations have overlooked the processes and people aspects of information security or cybersecurity. They're focused primarily on technology, and that's helped, and that's been a significant part of their defense. But only now are they really beginning to look at the processes, and very few organizations now are beginning to look at the people aspects of security. But what was so interesting and challenging and really upset me was the research also found that as cybersecurity advances and as the threats become more frequent, more complex, and more advanced, there's actually going to be a reversion back to technology. So some really good news for some of the interesting startups here in Israel who are looking at developing fantastic and advanced technology, and also for the technical staff who need to run and implement that technology properly. So technology, while many organizations, I won't say they put it on the back burner, but they're trying to get the balance right between the three things, process, people, and technology. We do think that in the future, more technology will be needed. We've actually seen that already because quite a few large organizations that I work with over the last couple of months have been contacted by who? Well, not by their security vendors, unfortunately. They haven't necessarily been alerted by the security technology they have in place, but they've been alerted by the government themselves. Sometimes the Secret Service picked up the phone or engaged with them and said, look, do you know you've been attacked? Do you know that your systems are infected and are transmitting information to another country or maybe another organization? So a lot of organizations' systems are not being triggered. And that is part of the problem and what we've seen over the last couple of weeks, couple of months with some of those big name attacks. On the right-hand side of the slide, you can see the 7 drivers that I mentioned. What I'm going to do now is I'll go through quickly each one and just touch on why we believe these are going to be challenges and also opportunities for this group of professionals as we move forward. So first of all, infrastructure. Infrastructure is changing so rapidly in many, many ways. And the 2 things that I'll focus on are, 1, cloud computing. Everyone's talking about cloud computing. You probably saw Apple's announcement over the last couple of days about the iCloud. Lots of excitement, still a fair amount of hype around it. But I would say a lot of my clients are using it, and a lot of my clients are using it very successfully. Our research says that about 48% of 14,000 organizations that we polled are actually using the cloud in one way or the other. But what concerns me and concerns us is that most of the focus has been on technology, scalability, and cost savings. And when you really begin to probe around the security aspects of what those organizations are doing in the cloud, there aren't a lot of concrete answers. But what really gets exciting, or worrisome, depending on if you're an optimist or a pessimist, is when you think about the other bullet, the blurring between your work and personal life and bring your own IT. Consumerization is another term that's often used. Many organizations I work with are starting to say, we will allow our employees to bring their own devices to work and use them on the corporate network. Those may be iPhones, Android devices, iPads, other tablets. We will put the right measures in place to help them, to allow them to use those devices on our network. There's cost savings, there's scalability issues, and there's just the fact that it makes the employee's life easier because instead of carrying 2 devices, he or she is carrying 1 device. But if you think about that from a security point of view, all the models that have been put in place today will fall apart. If you don't know where your data is, because it's in a virtual data somewhere that's maybe not very well protected by the cloud provider, and you don't know or haven't much control over your endpoint or the device because it's a bring your own device, how can we assure businesses, how can we give comfort to business leaders that information security is put in place? So I think that's going to be a big challenge moving forward. Data explosion. Incredible increase in data, and there's some fantastic statistics out there. But we're all generating more and more data. And what I think is interesting is a lot of us are generating data that we're not really aware of. You probably read a couple of weeks ago, maybe even a month ago, that some of the big smartphone manufacturers ran into some trouble because it was revealed that their smartphone devices were actually storing geolocation data on the device and then transmitting it back up to the organization that produced the device. I played around a little bit with that software, and it was quite shocking to look at on a world map how much information had been collected about my movements over the last 12 months and exactly where I was in different parts of the world on a specific day at a specific time. So incredible amount of data is being generated by our smartphones, by the devices that we use, but a lot of people are not aware of it. And when you think about that, that is going to generate a significant need for better classification of data. And unfortunately, the current classification approach, and many organizations that are trying to classify the data, are failing. If you think of the United States and WikiLeaks and the problems they had with that significant data breach, it was primarily around a lack of clear and well-defined data classification. And so I think that moving forward, data classification, both technology and process, but also the people, so the awareness of it, will become much more significant and is needed to help protect us better. Always on, always connected. Connectivity is going to increase even more. While we were sitting here, I flicked on my one of my devices, turned on the Wi-Fi, and I was quite surprised to see how many people out there had created their own personal Wi-Fi network using their smartphones. I didn't try and connect to any of them, but I think that just the fact that people want to always be on, want to connect to Facebook, want to connect to LinkedIn, want to have email, is going to drive some significant new risks and challenges for information security and cybersecurity professionals. Another thing that I think is really important that we need to think about is critical national infrastructure. Critical national infrastructure is changing. There is a significant amount of reliance on infrastructure that is actually provided by the private sector and not the government. And a lot of that infrastructure now is using off-the-shelf hardware and software. And a great example here, which I think was already mentioned, was the ATM or the banking networks. Many years ago when I worked in NCR, the ATM networks were based on proprietary software, proprietary hardware, proprietary networks, and would have been quite difficult to infect or to attack. But now, most of those are window boxes based on Intel, using TCP/IP, and oftentimes even connected via the internet. And that opens up the critical national infrastructure to a whole series of new risks that probably haven't been thought through in enough detail. Future finance, massive area of development, a lot of excitement in this area. A little bit of hype. What's interesting to my mind to think about when it comes to future finance is look at some of the interesting developments that are taking place in some of the third world countries. Fascinating situations occurring down in some of the African countries where very simplistic but advanced systems are being used to enable people in villages to exchange money, to pay for things, all using mobile payment models. I think this area is going to generate a lot of opportunities, but also quite a few risks for us. I thought the quote on the left-hand side of the slide was also quite interesting because there's actually a demand out there for anonymous electronic payments. Currently, all of the payment systems, electronic payment systems that are in place, still leave a trail of sorts. But there is a demand and there is a growing recognition that an anonymous electronic payments will come about, and that will create some interesting challenges and threats for us. But I think the other thing that I just wanted to touch on, which also concerns me greatly, if you think about information security and the three basic principles of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, where's most of the focus in the industry to date been? It's been around confidentiality and availability, but not enough on integrity. And that concerns us greatly. Because if you think about the integrity of the data and the importance of the integrity of financial data, if I was able to hack into that and maybe not steal the money, but just change a formula in a spreadsheet that did a calculation, what sort of damage would that do to the system? How much confidence could we have in the system if numbers weren't calculated properly? So I think as we move forward, and as we move more aggressively into the cyber domain and the cyberspace, integrity is going to become much more important for all organizations and all systems. Tougher regulations and standards. This is a big one. I've done quite a bit of work and spent quite a bit of time with the different regulators in Europe. I would say that regulation is a good thing. I really do believe it's a good thing. I think it's struggling to keep up with the fast pace of technology, and that in itself creates some problems. And I also think that the different regulations tend to be very country-specific. And many of my large clients are saying, I operate in 10 countries across the globe, and I need to adhere to 10 different, similar but different, regulations to make sure that I'm not running afoul of the law. And that is costing them significant amounts of time and money. And I would actually say, if you consider the fact that organized criminals aren't regulated, that we need to try and get the balance right. We need to try and reconsider regulation and make sure that we're not over-regulating. But the other thing on this slide, which I think is quite important to point out, and I really believe is important if we're going to be effective and help support our clients and organizations in the fight against cyber attacks is increasing standards on cybersecurity. The difficulty in exchanging information about attacks or potential threats is very, very significant. Most of the organizations I work with now exchange information informally. They pick up the phone and they call their friend Paul because they know each other, they've been together for a long time and work together, and they explain the problem and they explore possible solutions together. But what concerns me is something I heard the other day, because something I heard the other day was information security and cybersecurity is beginning to be recognized as something that can actually create a competitive advantage for an organization. I heard this from a bank. Okay? So the bank said, I'm starting to market everything I do about cybersecurity to help establish a competitive advantage in the marketplace. We invest more money than any other bank in protecting our internet banking users. Actually, in the UK, Which magazine, which is a consumer rating magazine, actually listed the banks in the UK which were investing the most in information security to protect their users. So I think that standards and the sharing of information will be important. But what concerned me after speaking with this organization was, if information security really becomes a competitive advantage, why would I share information? So that informal, very productive, very important informal sharing mechanism that's in place today could theoretically go away when organizations begin to say, no, if I'm better protected and better prepared than my competitors, if I get hit, I'm going to deal with it. I'm not going to share information with the organization next to me because they're a competitor. So I think increasing standards and possibly regulated by government around the sharing of information and how we share information is fundamental. Multiple internets and will one size fit all? Fascinating area that we're already starting to see come true and creating a lot of debate. I think what we're really talking about here is that, the internet is still the Wild West. There isn't a lot of assurance or a lot of safety that can be had when you're out on the internet. And many organizations and many clients are starting to say, hey, I'll pay more to operate in a secure environment. I will pay more if I can be sure that everything that I do, everything that I download is safe. So if you think about maybe Apple's App Store, it's actually a closed wall garden. And to a certain extent, that is actually a secure internet. Everything that I get from that environment has hopefully been tested and certified by the organization I get. So I think we'll see a growing trend to different, multiple internets that provide increased levels of security. And the other thing which I think is also interesting is closed social networks. As we know, Facebook is very popular. LinkedIn is used by many of us. But we're actually starting to see that certain people are saying, hey, if I want to operate safely in a social network, what I'll actually do is something completely different. I will operate in a closed social network. And there are certain solutions out there, one of them comes to mind is Path, which actually limits the amount of people that you can link or connect to 50. To try and protect your community. So I think those two trends moving forward are going to be important. Finally, the big one. And it was interesting to hear some of the solutions that are being tested and being put into place, because I'm convinced that this is very, very significant. This is the elephant in the room. The current approach to establishing identity and trust in cyberspace is failing. And unfortunately, the recent developments with RSA's two-factor authentication and key fob system only confirms this. And so what is really needed here is a completely different and maybe blue sky thinking approach to making sure that our identities and trust is assured when we do a transaction on the internet, when we communicate on the internet. And I think that this one is going to require a lot of time and a lot of expertise. And I think if we think back to the piece around technology and the reversion to technology, technology without a doubt here has a very, very important role to play. But without being able to ensure trust and guarantee the identity when we do something on the internet, there is a significant risk that confidence in everything that's been constructed over the last couple of years is going to decline. So, last slide. 5 things that you might want to consider to help improve the security in your organization. And this, as I said, is based on some of the research that we're about to publish. First of all, clarify roles and responsibilities at the C-suite. And that's really, really important. So no longer is it enough to delegate down, with all due respect, to the IT director or the IT staff. Business people and government leaders themselves need to be involved in these decisions. And the information or the cybersecurity teams need to be possibly on the same level. And as I said before, I think that's a challenge to us as a community to ensure that we step up to that challenge and support them. But this may require new roles and new responsibilities. So, interesting topic. It will create some debate, but we're convinced that more support is needed at senior levels. Number two, it's actually already touched on in the previous presentation, which is around situational awareness. How can you achieve a clearer understanding of the scope and scale of the risks and also the opportunities facing you? We recently did a poll as part of this research, and it was quite surprising, and we can share these detailed numbers with you if you're interested, quite surprising to see the lack of situational awareness when organizations engage in cyber activities. For example, how many of your organizations allow your employees to use Facebook? The numbers were very different, but what was really concerning is many organizations had no sort of capability, no sort of techniques to monitor what their employees might have been saying on Facebook or LinkedIn. And that in itself creates risks. Number three, I think, is an interesting one, and will create, once again, a lot of opportunities and challenges. And this is around creating a cyber information stack inside the organization. So as we said before, many organizations are struggling to keep up with the pace of attacks, struggling to mobilize quickly when something goes wrong because of the scale, the extent, and also the fact that these attacks are so international. So organizations need to have very effective, very powerful groups of individuals who can work together as a team to cross and cut through the bureaucracy and through the divisions in an organization so that they can execute quickly. And that includes information sharing inside the organization. Number four is around skills. And I am very concerned, based on what I've seen in the UK, that this is actually one of the areas that could create a very significant setback for the cybersecurity industry, which is there are not enough skills out there. It's very difficult to find the right people with the right skill set. And so a lot of activity is taking place right now in the UK around how do we train, how do we attract more people from the IT environment, from the universities into the cyber world and help them understand what the future is and what a possible career path might look like. And finally, and this was also touched on, and this one also is quite controversial, but it's around taking a more active and transparent stance. Many organizations and clients have said to me, I will not say what I do about information security or cybersecurity publicly. I will keep that hidden because I don't want to appear as a target. I think that's a mistake. I think that's the old way of thinking. I think now we need to be much more transparent, much more open about the measures, the investments, the techniques, the people that we're putting in place to protect our organizations, to really show that you don't want to mess with us and that there are softer targets out there that are probably the organizations they should be looking at attacking. But that also does include, and I think the time has come, to take a more offensive approach to cybersecurity. So I think back quite a few years ago to some conversations I had with a company here in Israel, actually, that had some really exciting and powerful new services which could be used in the online fraud arena to go on the offensive. They weren't very successful because they were probably ahead of their time. But I think as we move forward, we'll see more and more services, more and more organizations, both government but also private, who will begin to take a much more offensive and proactive approach to security. And that's it for me. Thank you very much.